China is looking ahead to the next 5 years. What are the main issues at stake? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Every 5 years, the Chinese leadership meets to set its policy direction for the future, a practice that started in 1953. The plan is the country's blueprint for economic and social development, as CGTN's Zheng Yibing explains from Beijing.
Proposals for China's 14th five-year plan and targets for 2035 are scheduled for deliberation this week in Beijing. What they bring is a new development pattern with the domestic market as a mainstay and the domestic and international markets reinforcing each other.
Some say that this pattern will make China more introvert and even fall back in opening up. I say they have a misunderstanding.
This is based on the fact that China has contributed about 30% to the world economic growth in recent years. And the trend will continue, even as a country is faced with a complex international situation and arduous tasks for domestic development, and especially amid the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Through stabilizing the domestic market, it will eventually help establish balance and mutual promotion between domestic and international markets.
The experts believe that China's opening up would only be deepened in the next 5 years with a more favorable business environment for foreign companies. Improving people's livelihood is a top priority. China sets to eliminate the absolute poverty by the end of this year, and greater goals are set.
We expect to achieve the goal of building up a moderately prosperous society by next year. There is no doubt about that, for per capita income in the country has exceeded $10,000.
The next five-year plan and the targets for 2035 will mark the start of goals for the next 100 years.
By the middle of the century, we will realize a comprehensive modernization in China, which will show in technology, agriculture and industry. And we will have greater social justice, fairness and international responsibility.
One particular sector will be attached with more attention.
The protection of ecology and environment was put into our 13th five-year plan. That was the first time ever. It will be deepened in the 14th plan.
The expert said this is consistent with China's commitment to tackle climate change with other countries and build up the green and circular economy.
China has had a wide consultation on the plan from various circles, including foreign invested enterprises. This is to make the next five-year plan more precise and solve more problems in a broader range.
The final version is expected to be approved by legislators at next year's two sessions, the annual meetings of China's top legislative and political advisory bodies. Zheng Yibing, CGTN, Beijing.
To talk more about China's five-year plan, let's bring in our panelists from Beijing. Qinduo Xu is a senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution and host of CGTN's Dialogue Weekend. Also from Beijing via Skype, Victor Gao is a chair professor at Soochow University. Yukon Huang is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Asia program. He joins us via Skype from Beijing. And from Raleigh, North Carolina, Klaus Larres is a professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Welcome to all of you. Qinduo Xu, let me start with you. This meeting is a key meeting. It will look at targets for 2035. It focuses on a number of sectors. You know, these are the kind of headlines that we get out of the meeting. These sectors include the economy, international relations, and protection of the environment, ecology and environment, as we just heard in that report. Put this in context for us. How significant are these priorities?
Well, I think the priority will continue to be given on this economic growth. It's really about the shift or the change of the growth pattern. For example, they will focus more on innovation-driven growth and also consumption-driven growth. Putting in other words, that's focusing on more domestic consumption growth. At the same time, of course, the trade will continue to be developed in that sense. And also to tackle the, I would say, problems or even difficulties created by the rising tension between China and the United States. For example, the US has cut off the supply of semiconductors to Chinese companies like Huawei and other companies. So you need to deal with that, for example, to build a secure, I would say, either domestic or regional supply chain, or probably focusing more on indigenous innovation to develop your own core technology instead of relying on the US anymore. So that will be also a short-term challenge, but also on the priorities, I would say.
Qinduo Xu, what did you make of the inclusion of the environment in the plan?
Well, the environment, that's a long-term issue. That's, for example, President Xi has made it the China's commitment to achieve carbon neutral in 2060. That means China, starting from now, actually needed to take some, I would say, urgent, very strict measures to reduce the reliance on coal and oil and gas, and increase the use of renewable and, for example, nuclear energy. In that sense, anyway, the goal is to reduce carbon emission, because China is the largest polluter of the world, about 20–25% of the carbon dioxide emission. So China needs to step up on that. Of course, that's a very impressive goal, but not achievable. So that means China will work hard in that respect. I expect some of the more policies in that respect.
Victor Gao, one of the terms we've heard concerning this meeting is socialist modernization. In fact, that's been described as one of the underlying goals for China, socialist modernization. Give us a breakdown of that. What does that mean?
Well, I would say for the past 40 years or so, the doctrine which has guided China so successfully is what we call socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now, in a sense, this is a catch-all phrase, because China moved out of a huge ideological box where we were locked in, for example, splitting the hair between socialism versus capitalism. For the last 40 years or so, what's guiding us is that whatever that works, whatever that promotes the productivity and efficiency in China, whatever that can help bring beef and bread onto the table for the Chinese people, will be considered socialist with capitalist, Chinese characteristics. Now, for the modernizations, of course, we started with the four modernizations in agriculture, industry, national defense, science and technology. Now I think it's modernization in all aspects across a whole range of spectrum, and it will be socialist in Chinese characteristics. And I think this will remain the doctrine for China's modernization for years to come. Allow me to emphasize one point. I think the fifth plenary session will not only discuss the 5-year plan, it will also discuss the 2035 vision. This is very important. This is to be, for example, not only a 5-year plan up to 2026, but all the way vision to 2035. This is what makes China very strong. It's orienting the whole nation in the right direction of growth and development. And I think the whole country and the whole people will rally behind this yet to be stipulated 5-year plan, as well as the 2035 vision for China.
Yukon, Huang, when we look at this plan, and we do know, of course, we are aware that even the best laid plans sometimes can go off the rails because of factors that we don't anticipate or variables that we are unaware of. And of course, this time it is the coronavirus pandemic. It swept the world. How will this pandemic affect China's goals?
Well, China has been very successful in dealing with the pandemic-induced recession. It's the first major economy to recover. Growth this year is likely to be 2%. And that compares well because in all the other major economies, they will be experiencing negative growth this year. And next year, we see China's economy probably rebounding up to 7 or 8%. So that's a good thing. But this doesn't solve the longer-term problem. As the others have mentioned, the question is, can China grow at a reasonably fast rate after the pandemic era? And this requires, in my view, not just relying on domestic demand factors, but a focus on how do you increase productivity, the quality of growth. And that, of course, is a very high priority in these discussions.
But Yukon, China has said that it will focus on domestic consumption.
Let me talk a little bit about that. I think the focus on domestic consumption is a bit overstated. The dual circulation strategy essentially says you need to focus more on domestic demand. And domestic demand is both investment and consumption. If you look at the indicators, prior to the pandemic recession, consumption in China, household consumption in China, has been growing at 10% a year for more than a decade. Compare that with the US or the OECD economies, where consumption has been growing at 2%. It's actually not technically possible for household consumption to increase much more rapidly in the coming years. If you really want to support consumption in the future, you actually have to find ways to support it through government social programs. And that will be very difficult because the budget is under a lot of stress. So I think that the real issue is not so much that you can expect consumption to surge. I don't think it's possible, actually. You have to ask, can you make investment more productive? And the government, I think, has many very interesting actions proposed in the forthcoming 5-year plan. I'd like to cite basically two. Improving rural land markets. There's a lot of land which is being underutilized in the rural areas. And if you can change or make the market in rural areas more efficient, you could generate much higher returns. And I think the other aspect is improving the efficiency of China's urbanization program. A bulk of the investments in China are going to urban areas, but returns to infrastructure investments in China have been declining steadily for almost a decade. They're about half as much as they were 10 years ago. So the real challenge in this plan is how do you reverse this trend? How do you increase the productivity of infrastructure investments in China?
All right, let's bring Klaus Larres into this conversation. Klaus, how does the United States and Europe look at the Chinese plan? You know, there was a piece in this past weekend's Financial Times, the British newspaper, which said it was a very broad piece on the future of China and its economy. But this particular piece said that in the next couple of decades, in about 25 years, China's economy will be twice the size of the United States. So what does this tell, trading partners in Europe and the United States, for that matter?
Yeah, the Western public is always a little puzzled by these 5-year plans. As you know, most Western governments are only in office for 4 years. So to have 5-year plans which go beyond the life of a single government is always seen as ambitious. Having these long-term plans in Western countries is usually the exception to the rule rather than the rule. Defense planning or big environmental plans, they go for over 10 years, 20 years. But most budgetary decision-making, most day-to-day governmental planning, that really goes from year to year rather within 5 years. Having said that, of course, everyone knows a 5-year plan and the vision the Chinese government will present to the Central Committee is important. And what worries the Western world is what the previous speaker said about that vision 2035, because that reminds everyone of the industrial plan China 2025. And that plan 10 years ago, it was announced, no, 5 years ago it was announced, that worried the Western world because it focused on these 10 key technologies, which also, for example, Germany sees as crucial for its survival as an industrial nation, and the same applies to the United States. So now everyone, and I would say from that China 2025 plan, that really inaugurated the more skeptical economic and industrial outlook towards China in the Western world. Before that plan saw the day of light, I think the attitude towards China was more benign, and that has changed since then gradually. So everyone now wonders what 2035 will bring. Will that be an equally ambitious plan? Will it be something to be really concerned about, or will it be, a more constructive plan from a Western point of view? And that is, I think, what most people would like to know about. What does that long-term vision 2035 and beyond that to 2049, what does that actually entail, and how does it affect Western countries?
All right. Let me put those questions to Victor Gar. Victor Gar, should the rest of the world be concerned by these Chinese goals, these ambitions?
Well, I think the rest of the world need to be highly interested in this because China's growth is not for China itself. It's not only for the Chinese people itself. It's actually a driver, an engine for global growth. Now, as a matter of fact, while the previous distinguished guest talked about the differences in government, in how the terms of offices were different, however, if you look at the best universities in the world, they always conduct that business in time frame of up to 100 years. If you talk to many multinational companies, they do not just plan for the next year or for 4 years to come. They plan for the very long term. And I think if those countries don't look beyond the coming 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, or 4 year term, then they probably really need to look beyond the horizon. Now, manufacturing in China 2025 is being conducted, being implemented. And I think the goal is by 2035, China will definitely be a developed country. Now we still call China a developing country, even though some countries disagree. They think China is already highly developed. But on a per capita basis, if you look at across the whole spectrum, then there are many areas that China still needs to do a lot of work. By 2035, China will consider itself to be a very developed country. And by the middle of this century, around 2049 or 2050, China will be a comprehensively very developed country in the world. So I think China's vision is that they never rush through anything. They want to do it in incremental phases, step by step, stage by stage. They do not lay out very, very ambitious plans. They lay out very realistic and pragmatic plans that the government and the whole nation expect to achieve. And for the past 41 years, I would say, whatever China has promised to do, it has never delinquished on its commitments. It's not basically for the public show. It's not for impressing other countries. This is really meant to be fully delivered. And I think we as a nation are on the path of delivering the last 5-year plan. We will embark on the new next 5-year plan. We are very much charging forward to fully realize the manufacturing in China 2025, and we will go in the direction of Vision 2035 all the way to the middle of this century, achieving the goal declared to the Chinese people that by the middle of this century, this country will be a very comprehensively developed country.
Can I just come in here?
Yeah.
I've no doubt that the Chinese long-term vision is very good and constructive for the Chinese people, for the Chinese government. That is, of course, what it is all about. You work on behalf of your own government, your own people. But I think in the world, particularly in the Western world, there is a real worry and concern that the rest of the world will get squeezed by the dominance of the Chinese economy, by the very innovative spirit of the Chinese people, by the many people, by the 1.4 billion people who live in China. So I think it is also justified that other countries wonder what that plan will bring, how it will actually lead to cooperation with the rest of the world, or how that rest of the world will be squeezed. And as you know, whether you agree or not with the trade war, and of course the trade war Trump unleashed can be strongly criticized, still the trade war was unleashed because there was certainly a perception in the Western world, both in the United States and also in the European Union countries, that China was playing not always fairly, to put it benignly. And I think that long-term vision now and the 5-year plan, it really is, as I said before, the ball is in China's court to demonstrate that it will be a fair world where everyone is not being squeezed, but everyone cooperates and works with each other.
Qinduo Xu, we did hear some of those concerns from President Trump over the weekend. In fact, he did an interview with the United States television show called 60 Minutes. Let's listen to part of that interview.
And who is our biggest foreign adversary?
I would say China. They're an adversary.
They're the
a
biggest.
Competitor. They're a foe in many ways, but they're an adversary.
So, Qinduo Xu, when China hears a sentiment like that the United States sees China as its biggest adversary, what is the response in Beijing? What is the threat that Beijing sees?
Well, like from Chinese culture or Chinese political culture, we don't really see, which specific country is adversary of China or even is the, enemy of China. No, we just see China is one of the member in the international community. And also you strive to compete internationally and you strive to develop yourself by relying on what you have. For example, when you look at the Chinese, economy, extreme poverty eradication. What we are talking about is really extreme poverty eradication. Mm-hmm. It's not like a poverty eradication. We are talking about China with a per capita GDP is $10,000 US. Mm-hmm. It's far behind many countries in the middle of the global ranking. And also China is trying to work is really to go beyond the so-called middle income gap to make sure there is a sustainable development, long-term economic growth, because we need to create a lot of jobs for the sake of social stability, the domestic stability. So in that sense, I would say China is really focusing more on these domestic issues. For big countries, probably, the challenges always comes from within, not from outside. Long-term development, short-term development. I understand the concern, internationally, whether China is somehow, building itself in the dominant position in some of the technologies, in some of the sectors. But if you look at the R&D investment in China, it's about 2.2% of its GDP. Mm. The US is 2.8%. So it's still far lagging behind the United States. And of course, in advanced technologies, China is still far behind European peers and the US, of course. So I sometimes there's an exaggerated understanding, exaggeration, for example, of China 2025. Many people say China is going to dominate in those technologies. Obviously, that's not the case.
Yukon, Huang, we heard just a couple of weeks ago, we heard from the IMF telling us that the growth forecast for China for 2021 is over 8% annual GDP, and that the average growth for the next 5 years will be between 5 and 6%. Is that a realistic goal? Is it attainable? Is it sustainable?
Well, the rebound in 2021 of 7 or 8%, I think that is likely, because you're measuring against a lower base for this year. And the same is going to be true in Europe and the United States. So growth in 2021 will be strong across the board, as long as everyone is able to solve the pandemic. The issue is longer-term growth. I mean, China's been growing at 6 to 7% over the last few years. Can it grow at 5 to 6% in the future? I would say it's certainly likely, and it's very possible, as long as China is able to increase productivity. But the key issue is, others have mentioned, are these tensions with the West. If there are more restrictions on trade, if access to chips, for example, becomes a big issue, then China may, in fact, experience even lower growth than 5 to 6%. When the IMF did a study a year or two ago about the consequences of trade war and technological restrictions and the potential consequences of what I would say a decoupling, it showed that China's growth rate in the coming years might fall by as much as 2 or 3%. So it would not grow at 6%, it might grow at 4 or 5%, even below the 5 to 6% growth rate. But the problem with the decoupling is that the growth rate in the US, for example, would actually be cut in half. Because if you prohibit major US companies, high-tech companies, from exporting to China, and they depend anywhere from 20 to 60% on their revenues on the China market, then America loses the capacity to invest in high-tech companies and to innovate. So there's what I call a negative consequence for everyone. Mm-hmm. And as the earlier speaker mentioned, the issue is China really a threat or not? I think the answer is you can have what I call strong compatible growth in the West and in China. China accounts for about 30% of global expansion today. Its trade surplus has declined dramatically to running about 1%.
Right.
So I don't think trade is actually the issue. Trade surpluses are actually being generated more in Europe than they are in China. I think the problem with the 2025 initiative, which was actually modeled on an industrial program in Germany, the focus should be on improving productivity and not on setting arbitrary targets for specific high-tech sectors.
Right.
I think it's those targets which we're seeing as a threat to Western companies because it implies some arbitrary interventions to try to get China to capture the market. And I don't think that makes much sense for China, and that certainly isn't a good signal to send to the West.
Victor, I've just got a little bit of time left, and I want to talk about one other thing that was in the plan, and that is China's moves towards military modernization. The Global Times newspaper said this is very important for China as the United States becomes more hostile. Tell us a bit more about what that means.
Well, as a matter of fact, when China started the modernization drive 40 years ago, national defense modernization was one of the 4 major modernizations China was aiming to achieve. And as far as China is concerned, its national defense is purely for domestic defense purposes. Right. It's not for outside aggression, for example. Therefore, I think some more money spent on national defense in China will really deliver a stronger China, not to be afraid of any threats or bluffing from any superpower in the world. And we see more and more such illicit and illegitimate encroaches into China in many areas, that gives reason that why China should be more and more prepared against a potential or for war with superpower in the world. That's very important because without preparation against war, we cannot defend our peace.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.